come here, Bill, so you can come tell me start.
Good afternoon. I'm going to wait just a minute before beginning as people come into the room. We'll be starting in just a very short minute. Good afternoon and welcome to Wentworth-Douglass Hospital's 12th Annual Spiritual Care Conference. The series is entitled Science, Medicine, and Spiritual Care in the Age of COVID-19. This is the second of 4 virtual webinars. Today's topic is COVID-19, Disruptive Change, a time of loss, a time for hope. And our speaker is the Reverend Deborah Davis. My name is Karen Wetmore, a chaplain here at Wentworth-Douglass Hospital, and my colleagues Julian Olivier and Michelle Guest will be your hosts along with myself. Please note that for this webinar, the chat feature is disabled and will not be used. We do welcome your questions. Please use the Q&A button to put your questions there, and then we will pose them to Dr. Davis, Reverend Davis, as we get to the end of the presentation. And there'll be time for discussion and those questions at the end. A year ago, who would have guessed that today our children would be attending school virtually or in hybrid mode or with masks and social distancing and sitting outdoors? That the economy and unemployment would be at levels unseen since the Great Depression? That all parts of the country have been affected, with many healthcare systems overwhelmed. That some 224 Americans would have died of a yet unknown virus to be called COVID-19, and the untold effect on our everyday lives. From the initial rush on toilet paper to our inability to be with loved ones, and the resulting painful isolation, mental and spiritual distress that it is our current lot. To say disruptive change is an understatement. Yet today's speaker looks beyond the loss in all of this and shares evidence of hope. The Reverend Deborah Davis received her BA from Dickinson College, Pennsylvania, with majors in English and philosophy. Her Master of Divinity degree was earned at Princeton Theological Seminary, concentrating her studies in pastoral theology. Reverend Davis is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, USA. She serves as director and chaplain of the Religious Ministries Department at the University Medical Center at Princeton. Reverend Davis then became director of field education and administrative faculty at the Princeton Theological Seminary. She is also a certified spiritual director accredited by Oasis Ministries. Debbie's presentation will be followed by your questions and discussion. Please use the Q&A button. Again, the chat feature is disabled. We will get to as many questions as time permits. Welcome, Reverend Davis.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be participating today in the 2020 Wentworth-Douglass Spirituality Conference. Since we're not able to be together, I invite you to get a pen and a piece of paper to write down answers to some questions that I'll be asking. I also want to really invite you to use the Q&A box to send in your questions, but also your thoughts about what's going on. I love the interactive nature of giving a talk, and this is the way we can do it today. Disruptive change. What is it? The term disruptive change entered the business and academic literature around 2010. It was used to describe the introduction of a product that so revolutionized the market that it replaced all former ways of doing something. The car was disruptive change. The washing machine, thank heavens, was disruptive change. And our good old cell phones, how could we live without them? They were disruptive change. The concept of offering products to cause disruptive change was used as an inspiration to create radically new ways of dealing with challenges. I want to posit today that it can also be used to describe how we deal with massive changes through world events. The definition of disruptive change is that it is irreversible. This is San Francisco. Affects a large group of people, impacts an entire value network, and has long-term future consequences. When a disruptive change happens, things never go back to being the way they were before. A large group of people begin to be impacted and begin to change their way of life. Values are reevaluated, and there's long-term consequences. I'd like you to quickly write down 3 disruptive changes that you may have experienced in your lifetime. Remember, disruptive change. Uh-oh, here we go. Back. Sorry. I need to go back. How do I go back? Oh. Try your back arrow. I'm not sure. There. Now you can go forward. Sorry about that. First time doing one of these things on Zoom. Be patient with me. Disruptive change is irreversible, affects a large group of people, and impacts an entire value network. It also has long-term consequences. So I've invited you. Use this. I've invited you to write down 3 disruptive changes that you've experienced in your lifetime. You don't have to ponder this. I've given you plenty of time, though, to think about it since I was fooling around with these slides, but you don't have to ponder this. You just need to think about 3 disruptive changes that you have experienced. When I asked myself this question, the first thing that came to me was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, November 23rd, 1963. I was a little girl. I was 9 years old. I lived in this little community outside New York, about an hour away from the city. And I was a very happy, self-contained little child. I went to school on November 23rd, 1963, and my 3rd grade classroom was abuzz with activity. All of a sudden, the teacher came in and she clapped her hands and sternly told us to sit down. We did. She then announced to us that President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated and there would be no school tomorrow. Well, I bet you can guess what happened. We jumped out of our seats and we cheered because there would be no school tomorrow. She was horrified, quickly told us to sit down again, and shamed us for our thoughtless response. This was the first disruptive change in my life. I came to that school that day as a confident, family and school-focused little girl. My world felt very safe today to me. But on November 23rd, 1963, that all shifted because I became aware for the very first time in my life that I was part of a larger community called the United States. I knew I was part of the United States, but all of a sudden, the world basically shut down for about a week, almost 2 weeks, as the country grieved. My world was never the same again. Fast forward, September 11th, 2001. I'm Director of Religious Ministries at the University Medical Center at Princeton, and I'm responsible for the care, spiritual nurture of about 3,000 staff and patients and families. It is a beautiful September day, and I'm walking into the hospital and I'm thinking, gosh, what a beautiful day. I'm I'm concerned about things that are going on with my 3 teenage sons. I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner that night. And I'm thinking about the patients that I'm going to see that day. As I walk into the building, somebody tells me right away that one of the trade towers has been hit in New York City. Well, in Princeton, we were about an hour Amtrak ride from New York City, and thousands of people commuted to the trade towers every day. Immediately, I was called upon to convene a meeting at noontime for staff and any families who happened to be in the building to process what was happening. Over 100 people gathered in our conference room, and we named people we knew who had gone to the World Trade Towers that day: husbands, wives, grandparents, grandchildren, friends, nieces, nephews. Everybody seemed to know someone. By noon, we knew that some of those people were safe. By later that day, we knew that some of those people weren't coming back. It was a time when we wept and we prayed and we hoped, but for most of us, we ask all the big questions. Why is this happening? An existential shift occurred in the United States on that day. We became so much more aware that we were a part of the world, and yes, that we were vulnerable to attack. It was a time of loss, of grief, of change in the value networks of people around the United States, and we entered a time of grieving that some people are still coming out of. Fast forward, March 2020, COVID-19 becomes a reality, and in the past months has killed over 1 million people, over 225,000 as of this morning here in the United States. COVID-19 has wreaked havoc upon the world. One thing that's happened is that we have come to profoundly understand that we are each responsible for all of our actions, local and worldwide, that our individual behaviors can have positive or catastrophic consequences. COVID-19 has been a time of loss. I invite you to write down the losses that have been associated with COVID-19 for you. We've already talked briefly about the loss of life. That can't be minimized. We can imagine our screen with 1 million faces on it. We can't even imagine that. It's beyond our imagining. Maybe 220,000, maybe 1,000. Any number is too many people to have died during this time. It's also been a time of loss of jobs and food insecurity for some people. Look at the bread lines back in the 1930s and 40s. These men were out of work and waiting in their bowler caps for food to take home to their families. Look at the cars on the right-hand side. These cars are lined up to wait for food to bring home to their families in 2020. And many of these cars are full of children and old people and young people, all hoping for enough food for the week. This also has been a time when housing has become insecure. Evictions have been put off, but some are beginning to occur. People are rent insecure, mortgage insecure. They don't know how they're going to pay for their housing. They don't know where they're going to be next month. There's nothing sadder than seeing a family's belonging cast onto the front of the road next to their house. Where did they go? What has become of them? It's also been a time, as Karen mentioned, of extreme social isolation, loss of schooling, at least the way they used to do it for our children, loss of playmates that came by day, loss of being busy with meaningful activities for those of us who are retired, loss of partners at work that you discuss the daily life and football games with in the workplace, loss of self-esteem, because no longer are people able to be productive in the way they used to be before. Social isolation. It's also been a time of the loss of human contact. Now, I am so lucky because I have 3 of my grandchildren who live right next door to me, and they are over here every single day, playing with me, watching videos, doing all kinds of things. I love being a quarantine with them. But I also have an 18-month-old grandson who's in California. I can Zoom with him, but all I want to do is hug that little baby. I want to hold on to him. I want to know that he's part of my life, and I want to hear his heartbeat. Maybe you have people in your life that you're longing to hug and to hear their heartbeats. It's also been a time of loss of safety in the world, of interaction, of knowing that anybody you could run into could give you a disease or you could give it to them, and that could mean a loss of life, a loss of hope for some, a sense of purposelessness. I invite you now to write down the feelings that you have experienced from your losses in recent months. Dr. Alan Wolfett of the Center of Loss and Transition has outlined 6 categories in which these feelings can be grouped. The first is shock, numbness, denial, and disbelief. When COVID-19 became a reality for me, my first reaction was, this cannot be happening to me. I used to live in New Jersey. Now I live in New Hampshire. It won't affect me here. It's going to stay in China. Denial. When the NBA shut down, my mind exploded, and my first thought was, wow, how can this be happening? Is there really not going to be any March Madness? Disbelief. When New Hampshire shut down, I was shocked. I was totally shocked that a whole state could shut down. I comforted myself by saying that everything was going to be open again by March 1st. Not so much. When May came, by May 1st, when May came and delays for opening continued, I went numb, plodding forward day by day, May, June, July, August, September, October, just doing enough to emotionally survive. Second category, disorganization, confusion, searching, yearning. For many people, this has been a really scary time, probably for most of us. It's like being in a wild, rushing river with nothing to hold on to, nothing to use as guideposts, the routines of the day having been lost or shifted. It's been a time when lots of people thought they were going to write the next great novel or do that wonderful home improvement project they had been thinking about, and I'm sure some people have done that. But for most people, it's been a time of disorganization, seeking to put new routines in place in order to organize themselves. Now, I personally, in April and May, decided that one thing I could put in place would be to wash all the windows of my 3-story Victorian house. Yes, on the inside and outside, 36 windows. This was probably not the most important thing that needed to be done at that point in my life, but I needed some kind of routine, something that could tell me that something in life was progressing. For many people, it's been a time of confusion and even foggy thoughts, or not remembering what day it is because every day has seemed so much like the last day. It's also been a time of yearning and longing and searching, not just for that canned soup and those canned beans and those canned vegetables, but for things that will give life meaning and purpose as we go forward. Third category, anxiety, panic, fear. And to this category, I would also add depression. As you can see on this chart, In January through June 2019, 11% of the people in the United States were diagnosed as showing symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder. If you were with a group of 10 people, 1 out of 10 people probably was showing some anxiety or depressive disorder. But in 2020, in May, 33.9% of the population described themselves as showing symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorders. If you're a family of 3 and you're in a house together, one of you may be experiencing anxiety or depressive disorders, and that affects the whole family system. It's also been a time of fear. Fear that I'm going to get that disease, fear that I'm going to give that disease to someone. Some people have hunkered down. I know some families that have been really staying in the house for the last 8 months. They have groceries and anything they might need delivered. They don't go out. They don't let anybody in. They are frightened that they'll get the disease, frightened that they could give it to someone. Life is riddled with fear. And finally, panic. I think we all remember that first time we went out to the grocery store after the shutdown began. It was about 3 weeks in, and I went to my local Hannaford's, my nice, safe local Hannaford's. When I got there, everybody was masked up. I expected that. But what I saw was fear in the eyes of the people that were surrounding me. I was surprised when people lurched back if I seemed to get too close to them, afraid that I might be infecting them. I wondered if they were infecting me. I watched as people quickly were grabbing things and filling their carts, or 2 carts or 3 carts worth of groceries, scavenging as much as they could get, quickly hurrying to the checkout counter, and then checking out and fleeing that danger zone. Hannaford's supermarket, my nice, safe, comfy place. Well, of course, that's changed. But in those early days, there was a real sense of panic that we weren't going to be able to get everything we needed. And now for some panic that this is going to go on forever. Explosive emotions. Many people during a time of loss experience explosive emotions such as anger, hate, blame, terror, rage, jealousy. Maybe you've experienced some of those emotions yourself. Maybe somebody in your family is showing some of those emotions and you just can't figure it out. Well, it's that time of loss, that time of not being able to do things the way they've been done in the past. And some people submerge all their feelings and then they come exploding out. Everything that's been boiling beneath the surface in the United States has begun to explode. The issue of racism has been a great source of suffering in the US and has been a powerful, invasive societal disease which has undermined our country. These past months, even yesterday, with another shooting, have showed that racism can no longer be denied, dismissed, or minimized if we hope to recover as a nation. Beneath those explosive emotions are feelings. That person you love who's been acting so angry, that person you care about who seems so frightened, that person who you know has always been steady and now is raging, is experiencing feelings of pain, helplessness, frustration, and hurt. As long as you continue to submerge those feelings, put them down, push them down, they affect you and can lead to things like depression, guilt, physical complaints, and sometimes thoughts, persistent thoughts of suicide. And yes, the suicide rate is up in our country. Some people are experiencing guilt and regret. Guilt that they haven't gone to see grandma or grandpa or their children or their parents, or they haven't talked to them for a long time. They've been meaning to, but they just haven't got to it. And now they can't go. Regret thinking about things that you would have, should have, could have done throughout your lifetime, and now so much time to think about things that you're spiraling downward into despair. Lots of people have reconnected through Zoom reunions. I know I've been a part of more than one Zoom reunion, and those are fun because you start to reconnect with people. But other people have used this time to enter a greater and greater time of sadness and despair. Sadness. Wolfett actually includes depression with sadness, but I've separated those out because I think COVID-19 for most of us at some point has led to a chronic state of sadness. Each day seems like the day before, and there's little to encourage hope. We wait and we wait and we wait for the vaccine or some miracle drug to be discovered so that life can return to normal. How many times have we said that? How many times have we hoped for that? Sadness, because this has been a catastrophic time and a huge grief reaction has impacted this whole country, even the world. And what we know about grief is that it comes like in a huge surge, a wave in the beginning, and then it's gone, absent, and we wonder where it's gone. And then it gets triggered over and over again by things around us until we enter a time of healing. It's like being on a roller coaster. These are the phases of disaster from an emotional point of view. Look at the beginning of this slide. On the left-hand side, the time of warning and threat. Remember when that was? January, February? We started to hear about this disease in China. Well, maybe it would be contained there. Then it was on the cruise ships. Then those people on the cruise ships were coming back to the United States. And then they were quarantined in the United States. And then COVID-19 began to pop up all over our country. And the impact hit March 2020. The interesting thing about emotional highs and lows is that when a catastrophe strikes, the first thing people do is come together. And so there was a brief kind of heroic and honeymoon period to COVID-19. Everybody got out those sewing machines and those old scraps of fabric and began to make masks. People were on television showing you how to fold masks. People started donating food to food pantries. There was a real sense of community cohesion, but it was a very brief amount of time before we began to fall into disillusionment. We're still in a time of disillusionment. I'm hoping today that we can talk about some of the things that move us towards that time of reconstruction, but many people are still in that time of disillusionment. I've noticed that there's been an increase of physical complaints of the people I know and love. Insomnia, digestive complaints, muscle weakness, and overwhelming lethargy. For people who have been in recovery, this has been a time of not being able to move forward. Many people have relapsed into addictive behavior. The phrase, the body keeps score, has never been more true than it is right now. And if you can't name the emotions that are going on within you, then you're going to experience some physical ailments, most likely. You need to be able to express some of those losses and some of those feelings associated with those losses that we've talked about today. The losses of COVID-19 have been devastating, and they cannot and they should not be minimized. If you are caring for others or experiencing any of these losses yourself, focused attention needs to be given to facing the losses and finding a way to move forward. One of my favorite philosophers when I was in college was Martin Heidegger. Maybe you didn't have a favorite philosopher when you were in college, but I did. Martin Heidegger, and especially his book, Being and Time. The term loss is elucidated by Martin Heidegger as he posits that human beings, whom he calls Dasein, can only come to terms with their authentic self when they develop a being towards death. We can only come to terms with our authentic self when we develop a being towards death. Death for human beings is the ultimate loss of everything we know and understand. Heidegger suggests that only when we can face the reality that life as we know it will end, can we begin to move forward with our life. COVID-19 has demanded this response, has demanded that we develop a being towards death. Disruptive change theory suggests that there's a way to use this time, this being towards death, this new understanding of ourselves to move in a positive direction. Groups and people that effectively deal with disruptive change are people who can assess their resources and modify their allocation as is needed by the changing circumstances. What do you have? What are your gifts? How are you using them? How are you using your time, your energy, your love? How do you need to modify that? How do you need to share your resources in a new and different way during this time of disruptive change? People that effectively deal with disruptive change are people that can look at their value system and see what they have been putting all of their energy into and decide whether that is really what they want their life to be all about. Where has your money been going? Where has your time been going? Do you need to reprioritize that? And finally, people, groups that effectively deal with disruptive change work together. They don't isolate. Many people have isolated during this time, and that will not yield an effective response to this disruptive change in our life. It's a time when we need to work together, to communicate, to interact, and really to seek out the resources and the wisdom of others to do some really good decision-making about our lives. So where is the hope? I bet you're really happy that I'm finally getting to the hope. Enough of the loss and the sadness. I invite you to write down 3 places in which you find hope. I would like to posit, and you might not like this, but I would like to posit that the real hope is not the vaccine. I know that I have gone through phases when I believed that the hope was the vaccine, that it would come and we would go back to where we were as a country, as a people, as a world. Well, you know what? We're not going back. This has been disruptive change. It is irreversible. It has affected a huge group of people, indeed everyone on the globe. It's affected value networks throughout every country, and we're not going back to where we were. It has future consequences. Most of us are aware of post-traumatic stress disorder and the symptoms associated with it, but I would also like today to talk about post-traumatic growth. The literature posits that positive transformation can happen for those who have been through a traumatic season of loss. This theory was developed by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun in the mid-1990s, and it holds that people or communities that endure psychological struggle following a time of adversity can often see positive growth afterward. Tedeschi says that people can develop new understandings of themselves, the world, and the people around them if they use the time to struggle with what they've been through, to name it, and then to move forward with a renewed appreciation for life. That time of reflection, who have I been? Who am I becoming? How will I appreciate my life? Yes, my life today. How will that be different? How will I more deeply invest in the people around me, in other people that I've met recently? How will I connect and not socially isolate? How will I begin to explore and utilize new possibilities, to do things in a new way in my life? It can't just be the routines. In all of that, one of the results will be increased personal strength, because you use the trauma to find your strength and to go forward. For many people, it will also be a time of spiritual change. Post-traumatic stress disorder has been shown to move towards post-traumatic growth in the veteran community. Veterans who were involved in programs which involved dealing with their trauma, finding their underlying strengths, finding where they were strong, not always looking at where they had been weak, forging new connections, remembering all those buddies that were lost in the war, but also finding new people to connect with, finding new arenas to give back to others and new missions in life. Veterans who were able to do all of these things have been shown to move from post-traumatic stress disorder to post-traumatic growth. And that's possible for us. If we deal with our trauma, if we find our strengths, if we forge new connections, if we find a way to give back to others and really reaffirm our purpose in life. A pathway to hope. Solomon Salve, in an article, a blog actually, March 24th, 2020, way back in the beginning of this pandemic, on internationalhealthpolicies.com, offered a pathway to hope by reframing the threats we have all been experiencing. He says that COVID-19 creates a worldwide threat, but reminds us that we are a global community. As I've said, in the initial days, we all wanted to believe this was going to stay in China, and it hasn't. Today, it is literally everybody's problem. COVID-19 has removed the boundaries of us and they and here and there, and in fact, has abolished all of these wonderful territorial lines we have carved up the globe with. No nation is beyond the scope of its devastation. New Zealand has done great, but as soon as it opens up, it will no longer be beyond the scope of its devastation either. This has been the ultimate disruptive change for the United States. You see, in our history lessons, we learned all about manifest destiny, which moved into United States exceptionalism. We were different, we stood apart, we were alone, we were a superpower. But you know what? We can no longer say all of those things. We can no longer deny our connection with the rest of the globe. And I think that's the good news. It has vast implications for our care of the climate, natural resources, and the value of each person on this planet. There's immense hope in the idea that we can move forward in a unified way to address global problems. Salve also says COVID-19 demands physical distancing, but requires societal action. Well, you know what? I've changed what he said. He actually said COVID-19 demands social distancing, but requires societal action. I think that the concept of social distancing was a huge mistake, a huge misnomer, which has had far-reaching negative effects. I think from the very beginning, we should have called this physical distancing. COVID-19 demands physical distancing. We all know that we need to be socially connected. Physical distancing has been required. I think words matter, and we made a big mistake in encouraging people to socially distance because for some people, that led them to believe they needed to socially isolate. And that was the worst possible thing that could have happened during this crisis. We needed to socially connect, not socially distance. We needed to physically distance, and we needed to move forward as a society together. Because of the physical distancing, we have come into a time of Zoom. As you could see in the beginning of this, I'm still struggling with Zoom. A friend of mine actually sent me this cartoon. There's a little bunny there, and the bunny says, "Good night, moon. Good night, Zoom. Good night, sense of impending doom." I paraphrase this on some of my sadder days into, "For the rest of my life, I'm going to need to Zoom," which will lead to gloom and potentially doom. However, on my better days, I know that the world is beginning to work together, especially the healthcare systems, that we are working together on a global basis to develop that vaccine. The hope exists in people coming to realize that we need to be proactive and increasing our personal, intergenerational, cross-national communication if we are going to move out of this phase into a time of growth. COVID-19 attacks human beings, but stirs up humanity as well. COVID-19 has forced us to look outward beyond our own families, our own cities, our own states, our own countries. It has forced us to move towards compassion and protect people we know. But it has also forced us to move towards compassion and protect people we do not know. COVID-19 has forced us to move towards compassion and protect people, cities, states, countries who we do not even care about. And that is radical change for us as human beings. But that's where the hope is, my friends, that we can begin today to evolve even slightly beyond our own self-interest. COVID-19 raises all the existential questions, and for some, the possibility of hope through faith. People have been asking the hard questions. Why am I here? What makes life worth living? Is my life worth living if I'm going to be stuck in this apartment forevermore? If I'm never going to see my grandchildren? If I'm never going to see those people that I love? Why is there so much suffering? Why is there suffering in the world at all? What gives life meaning? For some, these issues have led to despair, but for others, these past few months have been a time of spiritual renewal. And I'm inviting you to this time of spiritual renewal. Yes, the formulaic ways of gathering together, worshiping God, being faith communities have been curtailed. And many of the rituals that we know and love have been affected. We can't do those rituals the way we used to do them in the past. But after mourning the loss of some of our traditions, lots of congregations and individuals are beginning to use this time to reimagine and re-engage their faith. People who show positive spiritual coping are those that engage this time of internal reflection, which I hope is part of what we've been doing today. Naming disruptive changes, naming our losses, naming our feelings regarding our losses, naming where the hope is for us, internal reflection in order to go forward. I invite you to dig deeper into whatever faith you have been associated with, if you have been part of a tradition. Some people throw out their faith when the times get tough, but I think all faiths have wonderful resources for us, and I bet your faith does too, if you have at one time been associated with a faith. I invite you to dig deeper into your faith and reconnect in that way. At the same time, I invite you to allow doubt to happen. Some of those suppositions and presuppositions and assumptions that we've built our life on, that we got out of our faith, may not work anymore. They may need to be questioned. This is the perfect time to begin to question. and to cast aside beliefs that no longer work for you, that no longer are helping you. Some of those beliefs that you were brought up with may not be healthy for you. It's time to cast those aside. Most importantly, and I think this is probably the most important thing I'm saying today, it's time for each one of us to find a worldview that will serve as a stabilizing force in our lives as we go forward. You know what? This is not the last disruptive change that you and I are going to experience in our lifetimes. There will be more disruptive changes. There's an election next Tuesday. I'm sure that's on everybody's mind. And no matter who wins that election, there are people who are going to respond to the election results as trauma and as more disruptive change in their life. I invite you to use this time to find a worldview that will serve as a stabilizing force for you as you go forward so that you can endure whatever disruptive change pop up in the future. Finally, for many people, this has been a time of seeing a higher power, God, Yahweh, Allah, as working collaboratively within us, around us, and through us within this world. People have begun to see that that higher power, that energy source is there and is not silent. Yes, you will experience post-traumatic growth, and those around you will, if you are willing to struggle with all the psychological stress you've been through in past months. If you are willing to adapt an attitude of openness to change, and if you are willing to believe in the future as a time of real possibility. Oh, my friends, I believe there is hope for a transformed world if we unite for growth, if we invest in renewal, and if we embrace all that we have learned during these challenging days. Yes, you are my friend, and we will carry each other forward into the future. Let's make it happen. Thank you for this time together today. I'd now like to entertain any questions that there are or listen to your thoughts. It's been a real privilege for me to be able to write this speech during this time of COVID, and I look forward to hearing what thoughts you have regarding some of my ideas.
Debbie, thank you so very much. Thank you for helping us to face the stark realities of this day, but also for offering us hope. You know, as you were talking about the global community and how disruptive change can bring us together, I couldn't help but think back to those hours and days after 9/11 that you referenced, and how the whole world was with us, and then how that changed, and it changed very rapidly.
Right.
So I'm thinking how, yes, we were brought together, and we still are in many ways by this pandemic. We see wonderful things where people are helping one another, as you pointed out, but there also seems to be that movement toward isolation.
Right.
Driven by fear of the other.
Right.
And we're seeing it not only in our interactions at the supermarket, where people are afraid to look at you, but we also see it in our country, where the divisions seem sharper than ever. You offer words of hope, and they're sound and they're good, but the element of fear is so strong. how do we address that? And, you know, your ideas are very good, but there's this stark reality. You know, could you just speak to that a little bit more?
Right. I think fear is one of the most dangerous emotions that we've allowed ourselves to be controlled by, especially in the United States. That when we fear the other, we're going to have a hard time moving towards hope. If we're not willing to investigate the other, to get to know the other, then we'll never be able to be bonded to them and to really care about them. The whole mask thing has been part of that. If we care about ourselves, we put on the mask. If we care about others, we really put on the mask. We need to move into a time in our country where we move together and really where we embrace everybody who's on the other side of the winning and the losing next week. It needs not to be a time for one side to be jubilant and be casting angry thoughts at the other side. It needs to be a time of embracing. And this whole thing needs to be a time of us as the United States moving forward as a government to join with the rest of the world and cooperate in all of our efforts. It's really a hard challenge. That's why I said, you know, if we could just move a little bit forward beyond our own self-interest, that would be a huge gain. How can we each do that today? That's my question for you.
So there are questions that are coming in here, fast and furious. Here's one that sort of follows up on what I just expressed. The person says, it really concerns me when I see so many people being so selfish about their own desires and freedom and not taking the steps necessary to protect others.
Right, and that's natural for us. I mean, survival. In the beginning of the pandemic, it was about survival. We needed our food, we needed our toilet paper, we needed to get all of those things. But if we're going to move forward, we have to move beyond self-interest. That is very hard for us in our culture. We have been brought up, you know, when I was in first grade, they're asking me, what was I going to be when I grew up? Was I going to go to college? What was I going to do? And we all spend our lives kind of maximizing what we can do and how we can protect ourselves and our family, building those glass castles around ourselves. Well, it's a glass castle, my friends. We need to be able to reach out beyond to others and not act in a selfish way. It's really hard because some people assume that acting selfishly will keep them safe. And you know what? It's the most dangerous thing we can do right now.
That applies, I think, very much to the whole mask issue. We have heard people, I heard on the news the other night, a gentleman who said, you know, wear a mask if you think you need it. You know, if you're weak and you don't have a good constitution, but leave me alone because I'm strong, so I don't have to wear one. Kind of a disconnect. Here's a comment adding to your words of hope. Person says, if disease can spread person to person throughout the world, so can our love.
Ah.
Interesting.
That's beautiful. Love knows no boundaries. It has no territories. It doesn't stop where we've drawn divisions between us and other people on the planet. Love can spread, and I hope it can be as contagious as this virus has been.
Interesting. Question, what can people who are used to volunteering do instead of volunteering as they would do out there with folks? I want to spend my time productively, says the person, but I can't go out there and be with people. So how can we do something to help?
I think there's a lot of online ways that you can begin to impact the community. There are certainly nonprofits, all kinds of things that need online help, resources, where you can help with their administrative skill, their administrative tasks and things like that. You also can start to reconnect with people you've known. One act of goodness, calling up that person you haven't connected with for a long time, can go a long way. We don't see that as volunteering, but really reaching beyond ourselves to make connections, reconnections, to seek healing. It doesn't have to be a formal volunteer program. What it has to be is you using your life, appreciating your life, and going forward in the best way you can during this time. That may challenge you. You may be feeling a little isolated or depressed or have anxiety, but it means pushing past those boundaries to reconnect and to offer yourself and your talents to others. Even knitting hats for babies in hospitals. You know, there's all kinds of things you can do.
Could you say more about the worldview that you said was perhaps the most important thing that you would talk about, you would leave us with today? What do you mean by having a worldview, and how does that worldview impact us? And this will perhaps be the last question.
Yeah, I think your worldview is your philosophy of life. Now, if you're like me and you were a philosophy major, and since you were 9 years old, you've been thinking about the big questions, a worldview is something you're always kind to develop, but everybody isn't doing that. So I invite those of you who haven't thought about your worldview to write down those things that really matter to you. What are the most important things to you in your life? What resources do you have to address those things? How are you going to move forward? What are your concrete steps that you're going to take, even starting today, to make things different, to make this a better world, to develop a worldview which will bring us together and back to that time of cohesion and away from that feeling of separation?
Before we turn this back to Karen to wrap up, Michelle, we have not heard from you at all. You want to throw in a comment if you unmute yourself here?
Yes, you know, I've been listening, and you have been lifting up a lot of values that are hardwired into spirituality: connection, community, meaning, purpose, hope, and are offering up that these are, this can be a large contributor to a potential paradigm shift in our world, in our lives. Of all of the blocks or barriers to this kind of transformation, both personally and societally, what are the biggest barriers that you envision?
You know, I think Julian named it earlier. I think it's fear. I think fear is one of our most basic reactions when we feel threatened. We named the threats that are out there. And I think fear keeps us from going forward. So it's a way to name, engage, talk about your fears in order to move past them. You can't just pretend you don't have them anymore, right? If you're afraid of something, you need to be able to name it, express it, talk about it. And then maybe you'll be able to move forward. It's not a quick fix, but it's a longing that I have for all of us.
And also opposite action, take an action.
Take an action.
Right.
Take an action. Just take one action today. Right, right.
Karen? Karen, you are muted. You are muted.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for invoking post-traumatic growth. I am tremendously grateful for that. I think it's something that is a challenge to all of us personally. It's a challenge to us chaplains professionally and spiritual care leaders at this time to try to reframe and to challenge and to invoke and to exhort. Anyway, I think it was masterful what you've spoken about today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Excuse me. We'll appreciate your feedback, audience, by completing the survey that you will receive after this session. Certificates of participation are issued by the Wentworth-Douglass Hospital Education and Professional Development Department. Certificates will be sent by email upon receipt of your evaluation. Once the series is over on November 10th, more about that in a minute, the YouTube video will be uploaded to the WDH Hospital's spiritual care webpage, and you will be able to replay this series. We have ahead of us 2 more events. We're continuing with the next webinar on Thursday of this week, the 29th at 12 o'clock. The topic will be staying sane, spirituality, and mental health in COVID-19. Our presenter will be Dr. Fuad Khan, the Medical Director of Behavioral Health Services at Wentworth-Douglass Hospital. And the final presentation in the series will be led by the Reverend Sean LaFrance on Tuesday, November 10th from 12 noon to 1 p.m. on the subject of advanced care planning. Reverend LaFrance is Vice President for Population Health and Health Systems Integration at Cheshire Medical Center, Dartmouth-Hitchcock. Notice that we're skipping a week. That week, November 3rd, we are not having a session. That is the election day. And for reasons you can all figure out, we are skipping from there to November 10th. So please join us again this Thursday at 12 o'clock, and then in the final session on November 10th at 12 o'clock. You can find details about these remaining sessions and sign up at wdhospital.org. Thank you all for being here today, and especially thanks to our presenter, the Reverend Deborah Davis. Be safe, everyone. See us on Thursday. Goodbye.
Goodbye.